want to see what it looked like comparing to non-GMO and GMO in the Midwest? These are two fields separated by a fence row. Iowa. You can see what happened with two applications of glyphosate versus the one. Again, you're a heretic if you have a weed in your field. So you make two applications. And I don't know what the yields on these are. Howard hasn't sent those, but we had plots throughout the Midwest. You can see this type of effect. This is corn. Again, the only thing separating these two fields, non-GMO and GMO, was a gravel road. But you can see the curling, the severe drought. These are those fields just before harvest. You can see that gravel road separating them. They had the same drought stress, same soil type, similar fertility levels, but a little over 100 bushels difference in yield because of that compromised ability to maintain that physiologic system for drought tolerance. Another field, comparison of GMO and non-GMO. You see the same thing, type of differences showing up with Goss's wilt on corn. When the agronomist flew over the fields, over the area, you could pick out the Green Islands 2 years ago. When they went down for a ground truth to find out what the difference was, every one of their green fields, normally growing, were all non-GMO. The GMO ones had all died 2 weeks before black layer formation because of Goss's wilt. These are symptoms of glyphosate damage. When I asked some of our weed scientists how they recognize when a plant's been damaged by glyphosate, typical answer, if it doesn't die, it hasn't done anything. Well, again, glyphosate's a powerful chelator. The most typical injury symptom from glyphosate is bud and fruit abortion. Roundup Ready cotton can have 50% of the lower bolls sitting on the ground. Soybeans can produce 12 pods per node. How many of them do you harvest? You're harvesting 50, 60 bushel. You're harvesting about 2 to 3. You're harvesting 169 bushel, like the farmer in Georgia has for 2 years in a row. You're harvesting 7 to 8. He says, I know there's another 4 pods that I can get on each one of those nodes, and I want them. You look down at those plants and see how many of your flowers are sitting on the ground. Tremendous potential that we're not capturing. All of those other symptoms that you see up there, symptoms of nutrient deficiency, setting, yellowing, all of the other factors, even the drought and winter kill and sun scald. Again, those are nutrient deficiency symptoms. And by maintaining proper nutrition at a proper time, we can reduce much of that damage. The field or a trial with Volker Romheld, Germany. You look at those plants that were planted a day after the glyphosate, look at them 8 weeks later, and I have many of our growers will say, well, my crop just doesn't look as good as it used to look. Well, plants aren't as vigorous. And they blame it on the seed. Part of it may, if the nutrient density in the seed isn't there, you'll have a less vigorous plant. But a lot of it is just the residual glyphosate that's showing up. If you look at those lower plants up here, see that tip dieback. Ian Evans, tell you that's copper deficiency. Classic symptom. Copper deficiency. You see the graying, the streaking on those leaves on the right. Manganese and zinc deficiency. You see the yellowing, nitrogen and iron deficiency. Very classical symptoms. But if you ask an agronomist what's happening, it's too dry a soil, too wet a soil, too cold a soil, too much residue on the surface. Glyphosate in a day hasn't had time to be detoxified. Chelated with the calcium and magnesium, you're still getting the effects of that active chemical to further reduce the nutrients. What happens long term? So almost an identical trial in Wisconsin to this one of Dr. Romhel. 1 year versus 10 years. What you also see in Wisconsin this spring in the studies there was that you saw the water ponding on the surface. Because with 10 years of glyphosate, you no longer have that same soil microbiology that gives you soil aggregation to give water permeability and percolation into the soil. And so it tends to sit on the surface a lot more because your soil runs together. I mentioned failed promises, resistant weeds. You see the field on the left, you can see a few glyphosate-resistant amaranth or pigweed. That was 3 years ago. This last spring, you can see what that field looked like after it had been sprayed with glyphosate. You needed a GPS unit to find your corn plants in that. We've lost the power and the potential of that herbicide because we've abused it. And in that abuse, we've done a lot of other damage to many other things that we rely on. And so we're seeing an increasing concern for feed and food safety. We see it not only in the increased levels of mycotoxins that have just escalated exponentially for us, not just in the deoxynivalenol and the xylurone. We now find in North America that we're also finding the T2 toxin, the yellow rain type toxin produced by the Fusarium. Glyphosate stimulates Fusarium, compromises the resistance of the plant, and we see those levels increasing in these very toxic materials. We see a reduced nutrient density, and then we see the gene flow. We've known this for a long time, that those genes aren't stable. We see the pollen shed, gene flow from GMO plant to weeds, GMO plant to non-GMO plant, as we see with alfalfa, with canola, with soybeans. But then you also see the gene flow from the decomposing residue into the soil microorganisms. Again, those genes came from soil microorganisms, from Bacillus thuringiensis, the Bt toxins, or from Agrobacterium tumefaciens for the Roundup Ready protein. In decomposing the straw and the stubble, those organisms can again pick up those genes and other organisms so that 10 years later they can reinfect a subsequent crop. Consequently, we have two countries that will require certification on any corn that is shipped into those countries, stating that that corn was not grown on any field that grew one of 5 hybrids that hasn't been grown for over 8 years now, because those toxic proteins were taken off the market. but there's still the potential that those proteins can be picked up by plants today and produce those toxins that are extremely toxic to mammals. And those countries insist on a certification because they don't want them. We see the direct toxicity of residual glyphosate, and then the allergic reactions. Allergies to soybeans increased 50% in the last 3 years. You look at the Guelph study, or the Quebec study. Those pregnant mothers, pregnant women, and they analyzed the blood for the Bt toxin. 93% contained the Bt toxin, even though they had no direct farm exposure. 80% passed that toxin, that protein, across the placental barrier to their developing child in the womb. Comment was made that the level appears to be much higher than you could account for dietary intake, indicating that the intestinal microflora have the potential to pick up those genes and then incorporate it in our own. We know that can take place through the epigenetic effects because in pulling the genetically engineered rice, they found that the genetically engineered gene, can affect the expression of our normal genetics as it's moving through the intestine and the digestion process. Dr. Miriam Fernandez with Ag Canada in Saskatchewan, very excellent scientist, 8 years of research, again showed that the most potent agronomic character determining the fusarium head blight infection was glyphosate. You still have to have flowering. You still have to have precipitation. You no longer have to have temperatures above 80 degrees because the residual glyphosate from as much as one application 3 years before the wheat or barley is planted changes the physiology of the plant to increase its susceptibility to this very serious pathogen. If you use glyphosate once or more in the previous 3 years as a burn down, see a very significant increase in head scab. If you use it every year, much greater increase, and if you're growing your cereal after canola, an even further increase because your glyphosate usage is higher, and your effect on that soil biology, that bottom component in the diamond, is even greater as you increase the glyphosate usage.